was one of those happy mortals, of foolish, well-oiled dispositions who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment, but his wife kept continually dinning in his ear about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way of replying to all lectures of the kind, and that, by frequent use, had grown into a habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces and take to the outside of the house, the only side which, in truth, belongs to a henpecked husband. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master, for Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye, as the cause of his master's going so often astray. True it is, in all points of spirit befitting an honorable dog, he was as courageous an animal as ever scoured the woods. But what courage can withstand the ever-enduring and all-besotting terrors of a woman's tongue? The moment Wolf entered the house, his crest fell, his tail drooped to the ground or curled between his legs. He sneaked about with a gallows air, casting many a sidelong glance at Dame Van Winkle, and at the least flourish of a broomstick or ladle he would fly to the door with yelping precipitation. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A tart temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. For a while, he used to console himself, when driven from home, by frequenting a kind of perpetual club of sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn, designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. Here they used to sit in the shade of a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip or telling endless, sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been worth any statesman's money to have heard the profound discussions which sometimes took place when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveler. How solemnly they would listen to the contents, scrawled out by Derek Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place. The opinions of this junto were completely controlled by Nicholas Vetter, a patriarch of the village and landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to avoid the sun and keep in the shade of a large tree, so the neighbors could tell the hour by his movements as accurately as by a sundial. It is true, he was rarely heard to speak, but smoked his pipe incessantly. His adherents, however, for every great man has his adherents, perfectly understood him and knew how to gather his opinion. When anything that was read or related displeased him, he was observed to smoke his pipe vehemently and to send forth short, frequent, and angry puffs. But when pleased, he would inhale the smoke slowly and tranquilly, and emit it in light and placid clouds, and sometimes taking the pipe from his mouth and letting the fragrant vapor curl about his nose, would nod his head in approbation. From even this stronghold, the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquility of the assemblage and call the members all to naught. Nor was that august personage, Nicholas Vedder himself, sacred from the daring tongue of this terrible virago, who charged him with encouraging her husband in habits of idleness. Poor Rip was at last reduced almost to despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and Rip Van Winkle. Hello, this is Charlie, here to tell you the story of Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. You may notice I have a different accent than Natasha, Elizabeth, and Richard, who you usually hear on Story Nori. That's because I live in the United States, in the state of Alaska. My daughter Tevi and I have been playing Story Nori stories on our local radio station, KTNA Talk Kitna, for quite some time. One day, I asked Bertie why he didn't play many stories from America. Well, Bertie thought it would be a splendid idea to share some American tales, but he believed they would sound best if read with an American accent. But who to do that? Well, here I am. Be careful what you ask for when you talk to a frog. As you probably know, America was settled by people from all over the world. As it happens, this story takes place in the state of New York, in the vicinity of the Hudson River, which was originally settled by the Dutch. The story spans the time just before and just after the American Revolutionary War, when 13 colonies, including New York, gained independence from Britain and the British king, King George III. The story has something in common with Sleeping Beauty, only Rip Van Winkle is not such a beauty. It was a time when many things changed and many other things stayed more or less the same. Whoever has made a voyage up the Hudson must remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble height and lording it over the surrounding country. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed, every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains, and they are regarded by all the good wives, far and near, as perfect barometers. At the foot of these fairy mountains, the traveler may have seen the light smoke curling up from a village, whose shingle roofs gleam among the trees just where the blue tints of the upland melt away into the fresh green of the nearer landscape. It is a village of great age, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in the early times of the province, just about the beginning of the government of the good Peter Stuyvesant, may he rest in peace, and there were some of the houses of the original settlers standing within a few years, built of small yellow bricks brought from Holland, having latticed windows and gable fronts surmounted with weathercocks. In that same village, and in one of these very houses, there lived, many years since, while the country was yet a province of Great Britain, a simple, good-natured fellow of the name of Rip Van Winkle. He was a descendant of the Van Winkles who figured so gallantly in the chivalrous days of Peter Stuyvesant and accompanied him to the siege of Fort Christina. He inherited, however, but little of the martial character of his ancestors. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was moreover a kind neighbor and an obedient, hen-pecked husband. Certain it is that he was a great favorite among all the good wives of the village, who took his part in all family squabbles, and never failed, whenever they talked those matters over in their evening gossip, to lay all the blame on James Van Winkle. The children of the village, too, would shout with joy whenever he approached. He assisted at their sports, made their playthings, taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles, and told them long stories of ghosts, witches, Indians. Whenever he went dodging about the village, he was surrounded by a troop of them, hanging on his skirts, clambering on his back, and playing 1,000 tricks on him. not a dog would bark at him throughout the neighborhood. The error in Rip's was a strong dislike of all kinds of profitable labor. Could not be from the want of perseverance, for he would sit on a wet rock with a rod as long and heavy as a lamp, and fish all day without a murmur, even though he should not be encouraged by a single nibble. He would carry a fowling piece on his shoulder for hours together, trudging through woods and swamps, uphill and down dale, to shoot a few squirrels or wild pigeons. He would never refuse to assist a neighbor, even in the roughest toil, and was a foremost man at all country farms, like husking Indian corn or building stone fences. The women of the village, too, used to employ him to run their errands, and to do such little odd jobs as their less obliging husbands would not consider them. In a word, Rip was ready to attend to anybody's business but his own. But as to doing family duty, keeping his farm in order, he found it impossible. His children, too, were as ragged and wild as if they belonged to nobody. His son, Rip, promised to inherit the habits with the old clothes of his father. He was generally seen sleeping like a colt at his mother's heels, equipped in a pair of his father's cast-off breeches, which he had much ado to hold up with one hand, as a fine lady does to train in bad weather. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals, of foolish, well-oiled disposition, who keep the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whatever he got with least salt or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. Left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment, but his wife kept continually spinning in his ear about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way of replying to all lectures of the kind, and that, by frequent use, had grown to a habit. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his horses and take to the outside of the house, the only side which, in truth, belongs to a henpecked husband. Rip's sole domestic adherent, who was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master, for Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions in idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye, as the cause of his master's going so often astray. True it is, in all points of spirit fitting an honorable dog, he was as courageous an animal as ever scoured the woods. But what courage can withstand the ever-enduring and all-besotting terrors of a woman's tongue? The moment Wolf entered the house, his tail drooped to the ground or curled between his legs. He sneaked about sidelong grass, and at the flourish of a broomstick or ladle, he would fly to the door with yelping precipitation. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A tart temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue that grows keener with constant use. For a while, he used to console himself, driven by frequenting a kind of perpetual club of sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village, which held its sessions on a bench before a small inn, designated by a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III. Here, they used to sit in the shade of a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly of village gossip or telling endless, sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been worth any statesman's money to have heard profound discussions which sometimes took place when by chance an old newspaper fell into their hands from some how solemn they would listen to the contents, scrawled out by Derek Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word of the time. How sagely they would deliberate on public events some months after they had taken place. The opinions of this junto were completely controlled by Nicholas Vetter, a patriot, the landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to avoid the sun and keep in the shade of a large tree, so the neighbors could tell the hour by his movements as accurately as by a sundial. It is true, he was rarely heard to speak, but smoked his pipe incessantly. His adherents, however, every great man has his words, perfectly understood him and knew how to gather support. It was read or greatly displeased him. He was observed to smoke his pipe vehemently and to send forth short, frequent, and angry puffs. He would inhale the smoke slowly and emit it in light, acid cloud, sometimes taking the pipe from his mouth and letting the fragrant vapor curl about his nose, would nod his head in approbation. This thought, the unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquillity of the assemblage and call the members all to naught. Nor was that august only Nicholas Vetter himself sacred, the bearing tongue of this terrible virago charged him with encouraging her husband's habits of idleness. Poor Rip was almost to despair. His only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and the clamor of his wife, take gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. At the tree and share the contents of his wallet with Wolf, whom he sympathized with. "Poor Wolf," he would say, "thy mistress the dog's life with it, but never mind, my lad. Whilst I live, thou shalt never want a friend to stand by thee." Wolf would wag his tail, looked wistfully in his master's face, and if dogs can feel pity, I verily believe he reciprocated the sentiment with all his heart. In a long ramble of the kind, on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself, late in the afternoon, on a green knoll, covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow of a precipice. From an opening between the trees, he could overlook all the lower country for many a mile of rich woodland. He saw at a distance the lordly Hudson, far, far below him, moving on its silent but majestic course with the reflection of a purple cloud or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping on its glassy bosom and at last losing itself in the blue highlands. On the other side, he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild and lonely, the bottom filled with fragments from the overhanging cliffs and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time, Rip lay musing on this scene. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. He saw that it would be dark long before he could reach the village, and he heaved a heavy sigh when he thought of encountering the terrors of Dame Van Winkle. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance hallooing, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" He looked round, but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him, and he turned again to descend when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" At the same time, Wolf bristled up his back, and giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down into the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction, and perceived a strange figure slowly toiling up the rocks, and bending under the weight of something carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it. On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow, with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion, a cloth jerkin strapped around the waist, and several pair of breeches, the outer one of ample volume, decorated with rows of buttons down the side. He bore on his shoulder a stout keg that seemed full of liquor, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the load. Though rather shy and distrustful of this new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual alacrity, and relieving one another, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard long rolling peals, like distant thunder, that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine, or rather cleft between lofty rocks, toward which their rugged path conducted. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers which often take place in mountain heights, he proceeded. Passing through the ravine, they came to a hollow, a small amphitheater surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brinks of which trees shot their branches so that you only caught glimpses of the azure sky and the bright evening cloud. During the whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence, for though the former marveled greatly what could be the object of carrying a keg of liquor up this wild mountain, but there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown that inspired awe, checked familiarity. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, others jerkins, with long knives in their belts. Most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guides. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large head, broad face, and small, biggish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of nose, and was surmounted by a white sugarloaf hat, set off with a little red cock's tail. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a lace doublet, broad belt and hanger, high-crowned hat and feather, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses in them. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlor of Dominie van Schaik, the village parson, which had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest faces, the most mysterious silence, and were, withal, the most melancholy party of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play and stared at him with such fixed, statue-like gaze, and such strange, uncouth countenances that his heart turned within him, and his knees smote together. Emptied the contents of the keg into large flagons, and made signs to him to wait upon the company. He obeyed, with fear and trembling. They quaffed the liquor in profound silence, and then returned to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to repeat the draught. One taste provoked another, and he repeated his visits to the flagon so often that at length his senses were overpowered, his eyes swam in his head gradually declined, and he fell into a deep sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with a keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woe-begone party at Ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Dame Van Winkle? He looked round for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock laying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave revelers of the mountain had put a trick upon him, and having dosed him with liquor, had robbed him of his gun. Wolf, too, had disappeared, but he might have strayed away after a squirrel or partridge. He whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. He determined to revisit the scene of last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and gun. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints, wanting in his usual activity. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Rip, and if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of rheumatism, I shall have a blessed time with Dame Van Winkle. With some difficulty, he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the preceding evening, but to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock, and filling the glen with babbling murmurs. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped up or entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils from tree to tree and spread a kind of network in his path. At length, he reached to where
Where are you guys?
opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater, but
Dracula, where are you,
traces of
Dracula?
such opening remained. The rocks presented a high, impenetrable wall, over which
Dracula.
the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest. Here, then, poor Rip was brought to a stand. He again called and whistled after his dog. He was only answered by the cawing of a flock of idle crows sporting high in the air about a dry tree that overhung a sunny precipice, and who, secure in their elevation, seemed to look down and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he had thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country round. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that to which he was accustomed. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast their eyes upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same, when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his gray beard. The dogs, too, and not one of which he recognized for an old acquaintance, barked at him as he passed. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces, everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. Surely this was his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the Silver Hudson at a distance. There was every hill and dale, precisely as it had always been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That flagon last night, thought he, is out of my poor head sadly. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay, the roof fallen in, the windows shattered, and the doors off the hinges. A half-starved dog that looked like Wolf was skulking about it. Rip called him by name, but the cur snarled, showed his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind cut indeed. My very dog, sighed Rip, has forgotten me. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Dame Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. He now hurried forth and hastened to his old resort, the village inn, but it too was gone. A large rickety wooden building stood in its place, with great gaping windows, some of them broken and mended with old hats and petticoats, and over the door was painted, "The Union Hotel by Jonathan Doolittle." Instead of the great tree that used to shelter the quiet little Dutch inn of yore, there now was reared a tall, naked pole, with something on the top that looked like a red nightcap, and from it was fluttering a flag, on which was a singular assemblage of stars and stripes. All this was strange and incomprehensible. He recognized on the sign, however, the ruby face of King George, under which he had smoked so many a peaceful pipe. But even this was singularly changed. The red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in the hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. There was, as usual, a crowd of folk about the door, but none that Rip recollected. Very character.
Hey, number 2, come here.
There was a busy, bustling home.
Where are you?
Custom, drowsy, tranquility.
Why have you went there, huh?
He looked in vain for the sage Nicholas
I don't know.
with his broad face,
I'm new.
double chin, and long pipe, uttering clouds of
Can you hear me?
smoke
Come.
instead of idle speeches.
Come.
Or Van Bummel, the schoolmaster, doling forth the contents of an ancient newspaper. In place of these, a lean fellow with his pocket full of handbills was haranguing vehemently about
Do you
rights
have
of
soda?
citizens, elections, members
sorry?
of Congress, Bunkers
Do you have
Hill,
soda?
Heroes of 76.
Oh wait, let
Other
me
words
see.
which were a bit of jargon for the bewildered Van Winkle.
At first I think we should go to the safe zone, then I will give you
His rusty
the soda or
phallic,
medikit.
his uncouth dress,
Okay, thank you.
and an army of women and children at his heels has soon attracted the attention of the tavern politicians. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to foot with great curiosity. The orator bustled up to him and, drawing him partly aside, inquired on which side he voted. Rip stared in vacant stupidity. Another short but busy fellow pulled him by the arm and, rising on tiptoe, inquired in his
There is a
ear
medikit
whether he was
just
federal
beside before.
or
Yes.
Democrat. Rip was equally at a loss to comprehend the question.
Do you have
Knowing
soda?
a self-important old gentleman,
Let
sharp
me see.
cocked hat, made his way through the crowd, putting them to the right and left with his elbows as he passed, and planting himself before Van Winkle with one arm akimbo, the other resting on his cane, his keen eyes and sharp hat penetrating, as it were, into his very
Thank you.
soul,
Welcome.
demanded in austere tone what brought him to the election with a gun on his shoulder and a mob at his heels, and whether he meant to breed a riot in the village.
Okay, so we should go to the safe zone.
Alas, gentlemen, cried Rip, somewhat dismayed. I am but a poor,
Yeah,
quiet
wait
man,
for
a
me.
native of this place, and a loyal subject of the king, God bless
Number
him.
2, where are you from? Which country are you from?
Here, a general
Indonesia.
shout burst from the
New Zealand.
bystanders. Dory!
No,
Dory,
Indonesia.
a spy! A refugee!
Oh, Indonesia.
Follow him!
Okay,
Away
nice.
with him! It was with great difficulty that the self-important man in the cocked hat
What about
restored
you, bro?
order, and having assumed a
I'm from
tenfold
Bangladesh.
austerity of brow, demanded again
well, is there someone
the
here?
culprit what he came there
Sorry?
for, and whom he was seeking.
I think I heard someone
The
shooting.
poor man humbly assured him he meant
Oh.
no harm, but merely came there in search of some of his neighbors. Well, who are they? Name
There is a
them.
camp, I think.
Rip bethought himself a moment and
I'm
inquired,
not sure. but might be.
"Where's Nicholas Vedder?" There was a silence for a little while, when an old man replied in a thin, piping voice,
I'm new to this game.
Nicholas Vedder? Why, he's dead and gone these 18 years. There was a wooden tombstone in the churchyard that used to tell all about him, but that's rotten and gone too. Where's Bram Dutcher?
So we get to the high. Oh, I see someone.
And off to the army in the beginning of the war. Some say he was killed at the storming of Stony Point. Others say he was drowned in a squall at the foot of Anthony's nose. I don't know. He never came back again. Where's Van Brummel, the schoolmaster?
Oh no.
He went off to the wars too, was a great militia general, and is now in Congress.
Nice.
Rip's heart died away at hearing of these sad changes in his home and friends, and finding himself thus alone in the world.
There is another one.
Every
Another one.
answer puzzled him too by treating
Just
of such
another one in
enormous
front of me.
lapses of time and of matters which he could not understand.
Come.
War, Congress,
I'm following you. I'm
Stony
following you.
Point. He had no courage to ask after any more friends, but cried out in despair, "There's nobody here, no
Nice.
Rip Van Winkle." "Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" cried two or three. "Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree."
I think someone is shooting at me.
He held a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain.
Nice.
yeah.
Lazy and so
I got you.
ragged.
Yeah, I don't know where he was though.
Completely confounded. He
Someone
doubted
is
his
shooting
own
at me.
identity and whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the man in the cocked hat demanded who he was and what was his name. "God knows!" exclaimed he, at his wit's end.
Have you seen anyone?
Myself, I'm somebody else. That's me.
I don't know, but someone is shooting at me.
No, that's
See, someone
somebody
is
else
shooting,
got
someone
into
is
my
shooting.
shoes.
Run.
It was myself last night, but I fell
I haven't
asleep
seen
on the
anyone.
mountain, and they've changed my gun, and everything's
There's
changed.
a bullet
and
drop. There's a
I'm
bullet drop.
changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am. The bystanders began now to look at each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. There was a whisper also about securing the gun and keeping the old fellow from doing mischief, the very suggestion of which the self-important man in the cocked hat retired with some precipitation.
How do I
This
pick a location, bro?
moment,
What do
a
I
humble woman pressed through the throng to
press?
get a peep at the gray-bearded man. She had a chubby child in her arms, which, frightened at his looks, began to
Dracula.
cry. Hush, Rip, cried she. Hush, you little fool. The old man won't hurt you.
Can you hear
The
me?
name of the
Bro?
child, the air of the mother,
yes,
the
yes,
tone
I'm
of
hearing
her
you.
voice, all awakened a train of
How can I
recollection.
ping the location?
What is your name, my good
Sorry?
woman? Asked.
How can I ping a location? Oh, never mind.
And your
I
father's
figured
name?
it out already.
Ah, poor man.
I see
Rip
someone
Van
here. I
Winkle
see
was
someone here.
But it's 20 years since he went away.
We'll go to
from
the
home
safe
with his
zone,
dog.
man.
He never has been heard of since. His dog came home without him. But whether he shot himself or was carried away by the Indians, nobody could tell. I was then but a little girl. Rip had but one question more to ask, so he put it with a faltering voice. Where's your mother? Oh, she too died but a short time since. She broke a
I'm
blood
down, I'm
vessel in a
down.
fit of passion that had
Someone
moved
shoot
peddler.
me.
There was a drop of comfort at least in this intelligence. The honest man could contain himself no longer. He caught his daughter and her child in his arms. I am your father, cried he. Young Rip Van Winkle once, old Rip Van Winkle now. Does nobody know
Can you help me,
poor
bro?
Rip Van Winkle?
I'm trying to help you. I'm
All
coming.
stood amazed
Just
until
be
the old
safe.
woman, tottering out from among the crowd, put her hand to her brow and, peering under it in his face for a moment, exclaimed, Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome
Number two, are
home
you inside
again,
the
old
zone?
neighbor. Why, where have you
Inside
been
a what?
these 20 long years?
Oh,
Rip's
I
story
got you.
was soon told, for the whole 20 years had been to him but as one night.
Someone is over there
Neighbors stared when they
inside
heard
whatever
it. Some
thing that
were
is.
seen to wink at each other with their noses and their cheeks, and the self-important man in the cocked hat,
Nice try,
who,
bro.
when the alarm was
he's right
over
there.
and returned to the field, screwed down the corners of his mouth and shook his head, upon which there was a general shaking of the head throughout the assemblage. It was determined, however, to take the opinion of old Peter Vanderdonk, who was seen slowly advancing up the road. He was a descendant of the historian of that name, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the province. Peter was the most ancient inhabitant of the village, and well versed in all the wonderful events and traditions of the neighborhood. He recollected Rip at once, and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner. He assured the company that it was a fact, handed down from his ancestor the historian, that the Catskill Mountains had always been haunted by strange beings. It was affirmed that the great Hendrik Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and country, had a kind of vigil there every 20 years with his crew of the Half Moon, being permitted in this way to revisit the scenes of his enterprise and keep a guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by his name. His father had once seen them in their old Dutch dresses, playing at ninepins in a hollow of the mountain, and he himself had heard, one summer afternoon, the sound of their balls like distant peals of thunder. To make a long story short, the company broke up and returned to the more important concerns of the election. Rip's daughter took him home to live with her. She had a snug, well-furnished house and a stout, cheery farmer for a husband, whom Rip recollected for one of the urchins that used to climb upon his back. As to Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself, seen leaning against the tree, he was employed to work on the farm, but showed an hereditary disposition to attend to anything else but his business. And that was the American fairy tale of Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. I do hope you enjoyed it. Bertie says you can find some other traditional stories on storynori.com that involve a long sleep or disappearance. One is a Japanese tale called Urashima, and another is one of Bertie's favorites, The Fairies of Merlin's Craig from Scotland. So, what do you think? Was Rip Van Winkle lucky to fall asleep for those 20 years? How much has things really changed when he woke up? Let us know in the comments on storynori.com. And before I go, Bertie asked me to give you a message. If you run a community radio station, Bertie would be very happy to let you use audio from Storynori. If your station does not have a very big budget, he'll let you use the audio for free. Storynori's audio is also mixed into all sorts of educational and artistic projects. All you have to do is email your request to bertie@storynori.com. For now, from me, Charlie, here in Talkeetna, Alaska, bye-bye.
Bertie and the Magic Seal. Dedicated to Abba and Om. This is a story about a moochy, growly, bad-tempered old fish called Colin the Carp. Colin lived in a pond at the bottom of the garden, belonging to a royal palace. I would like to say it was an ornamental pond, but in fact it was all covered in weed and slime because the palace gardener did not enjoy cleaning it up. Just look at the state of this pond, Colin grumbled. And look at the gardener sitting under a tree transfixed by his foam. People these days don't know how to put in a day's work. A young tadpole whose name was Tim asked him, "Dear old Uncle Colin, why do you complain about the slime so much?" "I'm not your uncle, and I don't like slime because it's slimy," grouched back Colin. "But it's delicious," squealed Tim, and all the waterfowl, which is a posh word for ducks, geese and swans, honked and quacked and tweeted to say how much they appreciated the green slime, because extremely slimy slime is even more tasty to eat than plain old radioactive slime that comes in a big tin and they serve up at school lunch. One day the king was in a thoughtful mood as he strolled around his garden. "I know, I'll go and inspect that old pond. It's been years since I took a look at it." He wandered off in the direction of the garden water feature, but he couldn't find it for the life of him. You see, the pond was covered in such thick slime that it looked exactly like grass. The poor old king walked straight into it. Both his feet touched the bottom of the pond and the water came up to his knees. "Ugh!" he called out. "It's so slippery, slimy." And he fell face first into the pond. When he emerged, he looked just like a green slime monster. Even the palace guards did not recognise him and refused to let him back into the palace. "But I'm the king, and I need to get changed," shouted His Majesty as he stood shivering by the back door. The guard replied, "Public toilets are on the other side of the palace, near the ticket booth." The king complained so loudly that eventually the wicked queen opened her bedroom window and hollered out, "Let him in, you fool! He's not a tourist, he's your king, covered in green slime." It was only later, after the king had showered and his valet had put out a clean velvet dinner suit, that he felt his old self again. He examined his face in the dressing room mirror and thought, "I'm not so bad looking for my age." He went went down the stairs in a dignified manner to his office, where he planned work by placing his royal seal on some new laws. Most of these laws were the brainchild of the wicked queen. Her ideas included a tax on birthday parties, fines for parking your car in your own drive, and banning smelly people from public transport. If only the king had read the laws, he probably would not have agreed to them. But too often he was thinking of something else while he worked. He reached for his royal seal. This wasn't the sort of seal that flapped its flippers and barks. This seal was a small gold stamp that he and his family had sent out, and bore his family crest of one. All he had to do was to dip the gold seal into hot red wax and then stamp it at the bottom of the paper. The words on the paper would then become the law of the land. But when the king reached into his drawer for his gold seal, it wasn't there. He was rather absent-minded. Bother, he thought. I never left it under my pillow. But it wasn't under his pillow. I might have taken it to the games room to change the house rules for billiards. But it wasn't in the games room. And then he asked the wicked queen if she had tidied it up. She had not seen it either. It was then that he had a troubling thought. Oh no! It must have been in my pocket when I fell into that pond. And straight away he ran back down the garden, where he waded into the slimy water, this time on purpose, and he groped around on the bottom of the pond for his gold seal. The wicked queen, who was watching this from her window, thought, he really must have missed that seal. The head wading that slimy pond. You know what? I bet it's a magic seal. Now, a magic seal is something really special. If you bite down the wish and stamp the magic seal on it, the wish comes true. If there was one thing the wicked queen really wanted, it was the magic seal. Of course, the king did not find his gold seal on the bottom of the pond, but he did get all wet and slimy again. And so did the 3 palace guards whom he sent down to the pond to help him search for the ring. That night, over dinner, the wicked queen commented, "Poor dear, you must love that gold seal so very much. What's so valuable about it?" The king replied, "It's been in my family for over 700 years. So it's old. Get a new one." The king shook his head. Prince Birdie, who had been listening to the conversation, said, "Do you remember your royal dadness? You gave me an exact copy of your gold seal for my birthday. I don't make laws yet, and so I put it away in a drawer. Why don't I just let you have mine?" "Because it's not the same one," said the king angrily. "It's not the same gold seal of a bond that my father and my grandfather, great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, and my great-great-great—" "Yes, we get the picture," interrupted the king. He did not believe a word he was saying. She was sure now that it must be a magic seal, because he bothered so much about having the exact same one. Early the next morning, the wicked queen sent 6 soldiers down to the pond to drain it with a pump. Bertie was half awake in his bed, and he heard the pumps endless. He looked out of his window to see what the racket was, and was horrified. Still in his pyjamas, he ran down to the garden shouting, "Stop! Stop!" When he reached the soldiers, he asked, "Don't you know that there are fish in that pond? You'll drown them if you suck up all their water. One of them is called Colin the Carp. He's an old friend of mine." And Colin, who was lurking in a puddle at the bottom of what was left of the pond, grumbled to himself, "Colin? I'm no good. They call me a friend of yours. going a bit far. Our orders are to grab that fish, said the sergeant. Her royal wickedness has probably swallowed the king's gold seal with the stamp of the royal family font. Just then, the pump started to splutter. The slide from the pond clogged up its motor, and it no longer worked. Well, that's a relief, said Bertie. He ordered the sergeant to fetch a hose and refill the pond with clean water. Trusting that his order would be followed, Bertie returned to his room. But the royal soldiers were more afraid of the wicked queen than they were of Bertie, so they followed her orders and not his. Prince Bertie was not by the pond to see one of the soldiers wade into the mud and catch Colin the carp in a net. Fortunately, when Bertie got up at 11 o'clock, he went down to the kitchen to see what he might have for breakfast. And on the table, he saw